Welcome to Not About You, Season 2. If this is the first time you've listened to Not About You, thanks for listening. There's an entire first season of shows that I hope you'll check out. Each episode of this show features a guest discussing some aspect of their own identity, their own lived experiences, that they'd maybe like to stop having to explain all the time. I'm your host, Levi Weinhagen, and just as in Season 1, I'm a white, straight, hetero, cisgendered man trying to grow in my understanding of lived experiences other than my own. I also still love making jokes, and I'm kind of an idiot, so I'm very open to feedback. Find me online or hit me with an email, napod@gmail.com. This is Not About You.
I'm Jess Banks. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a professional and amateur geek of many kinds. I taught college, mainly history and world religions, for about 15 years, and then when we moved to Minnesota, I ended up working for a company that makes cardboard and role-playing games, like tabletop stuff, and that had been my hobby since I was about 10. And so all of a sudden I flipped roles from being consumer, but also still consumer, to now being on production side and helping other people enjoy the games. It's super weird. I also do a lot of activism around a whole host of intersectional issues, like racial equity, LGBTQ rights, disability rights,
I have a lot of questions just built on that.
Sure.
I mean, my struggle is to do a deep dive on nerdy game stuff. Like,
No.
That's where I will try to.
But the
avoid.
references to things may naturally fall into nerdy game or nerdy, just like geek culture writ large.
Well, that's interesting to me. That's like a subculture that has become normalized and commodified. So
radically different the longer I grow up and the community changes.
Yeah, who thought there'd be posers in the nerd world?
Oh, there were always posers in the nerd world. But, who would have thought that there would be a generation that refused to give up that hobby as they matured? I went from watching people say, well, I'm out of college now, so obviously I can't play D&D anymore, to like, no, I have a family now, we're going to raise our kids around the table, we're going to take them to conventions, and now there are kid tracks at conventions, and kids who've grown up entirely in that atmosphere.
Yeah, part of parenthood now is becoming a DM.
Yeah.
Like that's a similar role.
It really is. Oh my goodness.
Building.
Here's an adventure, roll for it.
Well, so I am curious about what brought you to the activism that you have been in and are currently engaged in.
Sure.
I think people come at it from a number of reasons. Generally, there's some level of personal connection, but that can look a lot of ways too. There can be like one overt trauma in your life that draws you into this issue that spreads out into all these other issues.
Sure.
There could be a person you're really close to. So I wonder how you think about why you do that, other than just because there's so much wrong.
Yeah, that's part of it. So I grew up in a family that was very much about service organizing as opposed to like power and change organizing. My grandma and my mom were both Girl Scout leaders and Red Cross swimming and first aid trainers and super active in the church and Sunday school and choir and all of those things. So I grew up thinking that part of what you do is you also do things to benefit other people. But I had a very different reaction to perceived injustice than they did. And that was fostered by a teacher. She was our social studies teacher, but also yearbook advisor. So I spent, hundreds of hours a year in her general orbit. And, was a radical in the 60s at Madison and at the Commerce Building, and had these amazing tales to tell. But her attitude was when she heard her students complaining about something that didn't seem right or fair or whatever, was to say, well, what are you going to do about it? And it turns out that I have that agitation and protest button in a way that my family doesn't. Like, their response to perceived injustice is to do something to help, as opposed to do something to change it. So instead of working in a soup kitchen, I go out and advocate at the Capitol or in the streets or whatever for, economic rights and things like that. And so people ask me, like, well, when did you start this? And my brain just keeps going further and further back and identifying, oh yeah, I raised hell on that too.
Yeah.
The one I always cite was in high school, so I was a happy little punk, and the intelligentsia of the school were also like the punks and nerds of the school, and also, yearbook staff. And
I love the secret intellectualism of punks.
Oh, yeah.
That was was my experience as a young person, too.
Yeah, exactly. So, the skaters were this is the late 80s, early 90s. So, the skaters were a subdivision of that group. So we all had, floppy hair in the front and shaved in the back. And the guys would wear the cut-off sleeves of T-shirts to hold back their floppy hair. And so did a lot of us girls.
Like a headband.
Yeah, we called them sleeveys. I don't think that's a universal term, but that's what they were in southeastern Wisconsin in 1988. And all of a sudden the school announced that they would not be allowed to wear those because they qualified as headgear, like a baseball hat on a guy.
And that was not allowed in school.
Right. You had to take off your hats, take off your hoods, things like that. And I and a bunch of our friends were immediately struck by the injustice of this. Girls wore headbands. We wore these things every day of the week. And to discriminate based on the gender of the person wearing it seemed bizarre and wrong. So, complaining in the yearbook office, Zig, our teacher, said, "What are you going to do about it?" And she threw down a copy of Title IX on the desk and walked away. And so we started poking through that, and we're like, oh, this is something we can do something with. And so we organized a work night to cut the sleeves off of many, many shirts from Goodwill and distribute them to as many people in the schools as we could get to wear them for a day of protest. And the same day we delivered a letter to the office saying that if they didn't rescind this unfair policy, that we would sue them under Title IX, which was really ambitious for a bunch of, like sophomores and juniors in high school to threaten. But they totally caved.
Yeah.
They caved by the end of the school day.
Wow.
And
which is very encouraging for you to continue that
kind of work.
Because that's not often how
No,
it goes.
it's really
in my
not.
experience.
No, especially not for young people to sort of put forward a gambit that gets respected and actually has an effect. And then I thought, oh, actually, we also fought to get our band teacher back after a sabbatical. They were going to send him to the elementary school, and we fought the school board on that, and we won. And this list just goes further and further back, and I realize, I'm like, oh my God, I've been a hellraiser much longer, and this is something my family doesn't remotely understand.
Oh, why this is how
I react to
that you are
things.
You want to afflict the comfortable rather than comfort the afflicted.
Yes, exactly. And that, I'm just not satisfied with the surface efforts that get put out. There's absolutely, there's a need for animal shelters and a need for soup kitchens and a need for, all sorts of different service things. And that's great for people who are satisfied with that investment of their time and work. And it's very important. It's very much needed. But I apparently can't sit still with that. And so, I find myself just getting drawn into this stuff more than ever before. I joke that I've gotten more immature as time goes on. Like, my excitement about roller coasters has grown steadily from being a super freaked out kid to somebody who absolutely adores them now. And it turns out that apparently my commitment to real activism is another thing that's been on this upswing.
there's an assumption here, but I know for me, activism, that can look tons of different ways.
Oh, sure.
But mostly comes with some fear or discomfort, either overcoming it or just embracing it. And so I wonder if you feel like your capacity or desire to hold that space has increased, or what have you tracked your relationship to discomfort, and do you have an endurance that folks don't have that lets you show up to these things?
No, but I'm less and less willing to sit by when I see something that I identify as wrong, and that's almost always something that damages or invalidates another person's human identity and dignity. And some things I'm absolutely clear on why people work on these things, and I'm so grateful that they do. One of the main ones is economic issues. And for whatever reasons, I've identified that just doesn't light the fire under me. But definitely things about like human rights are particularly gripping to me. And whether that's because I've just experienced more of other people's real lived experience as I've gotten older, or because I keep growing my world and sort of exploring and putting myself in apprenticeship to other people to see and listen and learn what they have to teach. I just see the humanity in people more clearly all the time, and I'm less willing to put up with forces that are trying to oppress that.
Like, that's all.
That's all.
One of the things that sort of stands out is that's noticeable about you, and I think that partly bums me out, which is weird. What I mean is, it's remarkable how much I see you at various spaces where people are standing up for someone's humanity, because most people aren't in those spaces. So like that, this is a thing that is, like, I think people who know you, this is known about you. Like, Jess does this stuff. And part of why it's unusual is because that's not the norm,
I guess.
So I'm curious if you give that much energy. Like, it seems like you, like the identifying that you don't get lit up by fighting around economic inequities, which is very real. And same thing, like, I think my own relationship to money is too complicated for me to just like passionately be in those spaces. But that feels like an awareness to just go like, I'm not going to carry any stress around, that's not my fight, I'm able to let that go. And I wonder if you have that in general, where you're not beating yourself up about.
No, I do beat myself up about it.
So you're not.
So no, I'm really not. So I think the thing that drives me into those spaces, the way that I engage on supporting other people's humanity in a very private way, by making myself available for conversations and validation and support, whether it's a container of soup or just a coffee date so that they can vent and just like dump it all out. Those things I'm very committed to as well. It's funny to me that it's strange that I would appear in these spaces. And I do definitely have some misgivings at showing up at a lot of different things, because I worry sometimes that people see me doing that and they're like, geez, like she's addicted to the protest, not committed to the issue.
Yeah.
But for me, it makes perfect sense, because I can see the connections across all of these things. And so if I'm going to say seriously that I am committed to the rights of LGBTQ people, and I don't show up for racial equity, knowing that the intersection of people's lives at that point is geometrically complicated by those identities meeting up, and that trans women of color are so much more endangered, even than as much danger as white trans people face. It's it's not safe. it's not healthy in a lot of ways for people to just live under that constant cloud of fear and oppression. And I want to do everything I can to lift that. But you can't not be aware that as those identities layer and stack, that the complications grow. And that for me, seeing that, understanding the intersections is what gets you around the oppression Olympics, where instead of seeing them as crossed or twisted together, you see them as stacked up and whose pile is taller. Yeah. It's just that I don't know who I would be without all the different mixed up things that I am. So I don't see a particular purpose in teasing them out. And then the flat answer to why I show up, why I spend the energy and the effort and everything to show up for these things, is not just so that people see my commitment to them, but also because every single time I go out to do something like that, I come back feeling like I'm the one who benefited. And if I had a problem with seeing, like with pure altruism or something like that, this would probably trouble me a great deal. But I always come home and I'm like, that was amazing. I saw something, or I heard something, or I felt something in that space of people with the same kind of commitment. And it re-energizes me, even if it just lays me flat on the ground for the energy and the physical effort that I expended doing that thing. I come home and it takes me hours for the adrenaline to come down, and it's pure love and joy adrenaline, not like, holy cow, I almost got arrested kind of adrenaline.
It's interesting that you get, this has been my experience too, is like you either get some emotional fulfillment or some deep learning that you wouldn't get otherwise. It's not altruistic. It's at worst reciprocal. Right. Even more sometimes just you're straight up just getting something, and I'm always like, am I even giving enough for what I'm getting from this?
No, exactly. That's exactly it. I go and I'm like, well, I did this thing, but damn it, I got like so much more out of it.
I'm a better person. Like I can feel that improvement.
And that recharging. I'm not fully an extrovert because there are things about me that need recharging, but even when I'm at my worst, like that opportunity to reconnect with community is like plugging in to, a source of voltage that is irreplaceable with anything else.
Well, so you mentioned that sort of the physical demands piece, and you wrote something a while ago that helped me get some clarity, so thank you for that. I think when I initially started showing up for things just a few years ago, I was trying to do activism that I saw.
Right.
And I didn't have the understanding of what are my tools and capabilities. And I've, even having these conversations, to me, this is how I know how to do this stuff. And you articulated that I am totally engaged in these struggles and want to show up for them. But also you shared, your own physical ailments, or sort of like chronic pain issues, create restrictions around how and when you can do stuff. And you shared here's some strategies of me figuring out what I can do based on your own abilities, which I think is really important. So I was just sort of hoping you could talk a little bit about both, because that's really one thing informing the other, which takes introspection and thought and unpacking and understanding. And I wonder when you came to that, and also if you can just talk a little bit about, because at its core of that is something that you talk about that I see maybe two people, other people on the planet who I'm connected to talking about, which is, I've seen the word ableism shared more lately, but I haven't seen anyone carrying it as a pay attention to this.
Right.
It's become a little bit of I should also mention that ableism is a thing, but I haven't seen as much depth where you are I'm going to lead with this, you maybe didn't notice, so I wonder if you could even just unpack what ableism means and what it means to you.
So I'll start with my own experience first and how I sort of landed up here. So 10 days before my wedding, which was over 20 years ago now, I was in a car accident. And it was not a terrible car accident, but it gave me whiplash and some soft tissue damage and things like that. And that appears to have been the trigger for the propensity, which people apparently have or don't have, for a chronic pain disorder like fibromyalgia. Your muscles remember trauma for a very long time, and it can scramble some things. Now, there's a turf war over what exactly fibromyalgia is. Some people think it's neurological, some people think it's rheumatological, whatever. What it ends up being is daily physical pain that's probably pretty similar to like flu aches. I think that's the closest analog I've been able to find for people who don't live with this experience. But also all tangled up in it are some cognitive things like having a foggy brain, like trying to perceive things through, like you've got your head wrapped up in cotton wool. You're just, you're like struggling to work through this sort of block thing. And of course, sleep problems go with it, whether it's because it's a lovely circle where you don't sleep well because you wake up frequently from hurting, and you hurt more if you aren't sleeping well. And then, of course, depression swirls into that too, because it really sucks to not be able to do what you remember being able to do, and to feel like you're fighting against this inexorable force all the time.
And I imagine you're aware it's always looming, even if you're not in the ache.
Yeah, exactly. And so, on the sort of ridiculous pain scale that people are asked to...
Those faces. Okay. Which face are you?
There are many sort of riffs on that, which are hysterically funny and actually closer to the truth. One of them, like number 5, is bees, and number 6 is bees. So there's lots of ways to get it across. But anyway, so I was pretty young when those symptoms started to present themselves. But that means that, like, my fibro is old enough to drive, so to speak. I've been living with it for a long time. And
it's about to be drinking age.
It is. It's alarming that my fibro could vote soon. And then with all of that, I'm also autistic, and so sensory stuff is already sort of an issue, and so I get very sort of different bends on some of these different things. So one of the things that can draw resources away from me is from being in a really overstimulating environment. And there's probably the most useful resource management metaphor that's out there that you'll find folks with chronic illnesses and even sometimes mental illnesses talking about, is what's called the spoon theory. And it's something that this woman, Christine Miseriando, developed when a friend asked her what it was like to live with lupus. And apparently they were at a cafe, and so she grabbed a handful of spoons out of the tray and stuck them in her friend's hand and said, "This is the resource pile that you wake up with today. I'm going to take one away for getting ready for work. I'm going to take one away for getting the kids ready for school and out the door. I'm going to take one away because the commute is awful this morning. You've got a major project due today, and so I'm going to take away 3 for that. Commute home." And the woman her friend was left with like 1 spoon. And she says, "But I haven't made dinner. I haven't cleaned up the house. I haven't done laundry. I haven't done any of these things." And Christine said, "I know." But that's all you have left. So you have to make the choice. And yes, you are always going to be behind. There's just no way around it. I don't know if I'm the one who came up with this. I imagine there are many minds that have come up with this, but I'll often talk about going into spoon debt for things that really matter to me. And I find that one of the main places that happens, where I say, you know what, I don't really have the resources physically or mentally, or usually physically when it comes to activism. I don't really have the spoons to use on this, but I'm going to borrow some because it matters to me. Tomorrow's going to suck a fair bit. Yeah. And maybe, you're just not going to have, maybe you're only going to have like 4 spoons for the next 2 or 3 days. And so, but it is worth it to me in that case, in that time, to show up. And I have a very hard time not jumping into the breach on helping when I'm in those situations. And so very high chances are that if I'm at a march or I'm at an action of some kind, that I'm also going to be marshalling, which are the folks in the neon vests usually, who are sort of just making sure that people stay on the sidewalk or stay in the lane that we're marching on, that nobody falls behind, that if there are counter protesters or other people trying to escalate with the folks that are demonstrating for whatever issue, then it's our job to lean in and de-escalate that kind of stuff and make sure that we keep, take care of the people who are showing up for us. And for me, that's very much like motherhood. And so it feels very natural to me to step into that space and just sort of mother everybody and make sure that everybody is okay and taken care of.
Because you are a mother.
I am. I have two sons, yeah. Let's add to the pile here.
Yeah.
I'm the mother of two sons. One of them is 14 and the other one's almost 11.
And they love taking spoons.
They love taking spoons. Although they are very aware of my limitations as well. And one of the most heartbreaking things when they were younger was that I realized that Griffin, my younger, could recognize my body language when I was hurting, and sometimes he would bring me my pain medication and say, I can see you're hurting. And it just shattered my heart that he was even aware to that. I don't want them to know how laid out I am. And at 5, that shouldn't even be on your radar. So part of me is like, yay, me, I have observant, compassionate kids.
Hey, and that's an act of love.
It is absolutely. But at the same time, if you think like motherhood is about caring for them and, protecting them from unpleasant things and being there for them, that sort of reciprocal attention can be hard to take.
Yeah, you don't want to add to their stress load.
No, exactly. And I think there's something concerning about knowing that your mom isn't always well all the time. And it's very hard to say, no, I'll go watch you swim, but I can't go swimming today because I just don't have it. And I do worry sometimes that someday they're going to be resentful of the effort that I do put into showing up for these things, and that then when I'm laid up, I can't go to the park with them that day because I spent those spoons the previous day doing this thing. But we do work really hard. I think if there's one thing we have made a point of trying to teach them since day one is that we don't just talk about our beliefs and our morals in our family. We do something about them. And this is how it looks for me. This is how it might look for you. That there's all different ways to engage with those things, but we don't just sit on them. We don't just sit and talk about them. That they're sort of incomplete without action attached to them.
So you're modeling, but you're also fighting this larger systemic oppression that they're oppressed by as well.
Yeah.
Even if they benefit from parts of it. So I
yeah.
I don't think that's a justification. I've had a lot of these dad conversations with myself because, I have an 11-year-old and she would take any time I have to give.
Sure, exactly.
Which means, I'll bring her to stuff. Like I like her to be present at places.
Yeah. My husband isn't as much he doesn't get the same things that I do out of being present in all of those spaces. He supports it 100%, but we joke that he's our chief logistical officer, which means a lot of times that he's the one who makes sure that, that somebody's home with the kids, so that I can go out to the meeting or the thing and be present there, and that's just something that he stands foursquare behind me and takes care of these things so that I can do this on behalf of our family. So some people in the movements think that he is mythical. He'll show up someplace finally and I'll be like, this is Cam. And they'll say, oh my God, I thought you were
meant Flight Squad unicorn. Or something that was delivering.
I thought he was like a unicorn or something.
That home support is so important in, I think, any kind of
completely
justice
critical.
work and doesn't get acknowledged. And there's this really pronounced, in my experience again, of there are a lot of powerful women, sort of cisgendered women particularly, who show up and lead a lot of movements and often don't have a home support in that same way, or not talked about. And I think it's really important, and it seems sort of underrepresented. And so I'm glad just to hear you articulate that.
Yeah, and you know, having looked at the history of various movements and things, you know, you look at the civil rights movement, and you have one of two things happening. Either the women aren't credited as much, or they are more intermittently present and visible in the work that's being done because they also had domestic duties that they were expected to do. And, you know, it wasn't 2017 where a husband would feel like taking up household duties is a legitimate form of support. But that was already set up a little bit by my physical restrictions, because scrubbing out the bathtub destroys me as fully as marshalling a 2-mile march.
It's not worth the clean bath.
It is not.
Yeah.
I do not care enough about that. I would much rather use those resources to do something else.
Well, let me ask you this question.
Sure.
Because this, I think, that maybe this gets at something you do talk about a fair amount. You've talked about this chronic pain disorder, and you've talked about autism and just mental health. And one of the biggest narratives is, wouldn't it be great if you didn't have those and you could just live a normal life?
Yeah.
And that is really hard, even for me personally, to fight through that idea, because I take medicine for anxiety disorder every day, and I go back and forth about, I don't love this on the bad days, but also it's like intrinsically part of who I am.
Yeah. And you wouldn't be you.
I had a therapist once say, like, when I was leery of taking medicine, he was like, the good and bad news is I can't change who you are, no matter what medicine I give you. There are obviously extremes. But I wonder if you can talk a bit about the idea of being fixed.
Oh, yeah. To me, it's really interesting because there are things, there are disabilities that I would gladly set down and walk away from. I think the biggest one for me is depression. I don't feel like that adds anything to who I am. It only takes away. But that being said, I don't know who I would be if I weren't autistic. And I don't even know who I would be anymore without the fibro. It forces you to clarify a lot of things. It forces you to make choices and priorities. One of the hardest things for me to deal with when I first got sick, and for years after that, was that I used to be a really big list maker. I lived and died by 3x5 index cards where I would write the bullet list of what I had to do that day and just knock them down. And for a long time, I would say probably at least 4 years, I kept making to-do lists for the person I used to be. And invariably, I'd get through like a third, maybe a half on a good day of what I had written down that I used to be able to get all the way through. So then comes both the guilt of not having gotten through all of that stuff and sort of beating myself up over, you just didn't try hard enough, and having half a list to start tomorrow on top of the tomorrow stuff and never, ever, ever catching up. That I still resent because I still remember that person. I lived a long time as that person. But at the same time, I think clarifying and prioritizing what matters most to me and what I can walk away from is a skill that everybody should be able to do, because they aren't all weighted the same. And if it's going to come down to showing up for a community that's in pain because somebody was shot by a cop, or because somebody is trying to humiliate and frighten and endanger trans kids in our schools. That, next to the difference between a home-cooked meal and McDonald's, doesn't signify. It just doesn't anymore. And similarly, also with the autism and stuff, that influences the way that I sense and interact with the world. And I've been doing it my whole life, even though I didn't know that's what it was until my kid got a diagnosis, and I all of a sudden started realizing, well, this about him, and this about him, and this about him are this about me, and this about me, and this about me. And having those answers for what they are, what these things are, is so valuable, because then you know what language you're trying to speak. And knowing this about myself has made it possible for me to be a better mom and a better advocate for him. But the one thing that we run up against in education, and we run up against it especially in the world of, liberal and even radical activism, is that there is not a support system in place for disabled people to be involved. And that's where the ableism thing comes in. It is assumed that if you are committed to a cause, that you will show up and put all of your resources behind it, and that can be limitless. Even just in the nonprofit world, there's a sense that if you can't give more to the point of burnout, then you aren't fully committed to this work. That commitment takes the shape of these hours and these actions and this time scale for, a coordinated effort. And that's part of what limits many of the jobs and the leadership roles to fairly young people who haven't necessarily encountered a major physical obstacle, but it can develop them. It certainly leads to mental health issues for a lot of activist leaders, and not knowing how to ration yourself the way somebody who has to ration themselves every day, I think, leads to a lot more of those leaders having to walk away from it at some point, because there's nobody telling you have to engage in self-care, and there are no limits imposed on you. There are only self-imposed limits, and you can talk yourself out of a self-imposed limit very easily, because everything else is important too. I personally struggle with this because not only do I resent the limitations that my physical disability puts on my ability to show up and do the things, I have to say, well, how far are we marching? And, is there a rally at one point or the other, or maybe if I really can't march today, where I'm there for that, and then I peel off before the march happens, or I show up after the march happens. And it can be really difficult to challenge organizers in that space who are obviously prioritizing one issue and say, hey, you're being super inclusive about a lot of other things, but there's a reason why disabled folks don't show up for your stuff, and it's because there are no accommodations. And that goes for protest actions, but it also goes for celebrations and more social events. One of the organizations that I worked with a lot has a gala every year, and the last one I went to was like 3 years ago, because despite all of my efforts to communicate to them some of the problems in the space that they had chosen, like the only ramps available inside were slippery marble, and I'm not having a very steady day if I'm trying to use a cane to get around. That is danger central. If somebody spills a drink on that could be a major fall. That would mess me up for months, could trigger a flare-up that just goes on and on. That all of the seats were seats that were facing the stage, but then, a third of the seats at least were side on to the stage, which meant that somebody with deafness or hard of hearing, somebody who is deaf, sorry, I don't like person first language, I am not a person with autism. I am an autistic person. That members of the deaf community, hard of hearing community, if they're forced to sit on those side seats, they are effectively blocked from seeing and understanding what is going on the stage because they don't have that front exposure. That if your light show or whatever kind of party lights you have are super swimmy and weird, that's going to make it very difficult for both visually impaired people, but also people like me with sensory processing stuff to stay in that space because it's disorienting and it's overwhelming, and that cuts down on the resources I have to give by trying to normalize stuff. And I offered to them to help them assess a space and see what they could do to make it more disability inclusive, and I was thanked and rejected. And it's enormously frustrating. It's hard when, I'm a white queer woman, of a particularly middle age. Just so weird all by itself. But
it depends on how long you plan to live.
It's true. You're right. I'm halfway, hopefully. It's hard for me to walk into spaces where we're trying to really center Black voices or immigrant voices or things that I am not, and to challenge them on issues of disability discrimination or accommodation. And that's most of the time one level of complexity more than anybody wants to go to.
Mm-hmm. It feels like the message embedded in that, and it's not, this is in these activist instances, but then writ large, society-wide, is your existence is just a little too much trouble.
Yeah.
That's the
that we are
subtext.
Inconvenient.
Yeah, and it is your needs are just, they're tiring me.
Yeah.
So pass.
If you can't do it this way, I guess you're not going to be able to do it.
Right. Which is the message at most layers of some oppression is if your inability to change is too big of a problem for the mainstream.
Yeah.
And you've hit on enough areas where you're like, oh, you're even too much for the people who are pushing for all this change. They're still oh, come on.
Yeah. How many, we're trying to center this thing. We can't take everybody's needs into account.
Right.
And
the marketing's too hard. With the message, we just can't.
Or we just, unless you're willing, this is another thing that happens a lot, is unless you're willing to take care of that, we can't spare anybody to take care of that.
Yeah.
And the irony, of course, is that intrinsically, I might not be able to do that because I have limited resources as a disabled person.
Right.
And it even gets more complex because for people who don't know me as well as folks that I've been working with for years, it sounds really bizarre, but I've often wished that I bruised everywhere I hurt.
Because it's easy to deny your pain.
Oh, yeah. I've had doctors deny it.
Well, did it take you a while to accept it was a real thing?
Oh, yeah. Interestingly, because I had been on a antidepressant that for some reason that nobody understands is one of the things that can kind of help people manage fibro symptoms. And I was on that for tension headaches because, hey, grad school. But it has a lifespan, and at various points in somebody's interaction with that drug, it can just stop working. And it was all of a sudden, it was like this overstuffed closet that just couldn't hold one more tennis ball, and it just all piled out over the course of one summer. And I was overwhelmed and disoriented and really upset. And the nurse practitioner who figured it out didn't tell me up front what she thought it was. She said, I want you to go and take a look at a book about this thing. So, I'm walking around Barnes & Noble looking for books on fibromyalgia, whatever. And
just in that, what section is that?
I know, exactly. They're like, what is that? I'm like, I don't know. But I found a book and I started leafing through it, and I found a list of symptoms. And it was like a checklist. And strangely enough, we relived that same experience when my son was diagnosed with Asperger's, because it looked like somebody had followed him around all day and written down all the weird moon things that he does. And instead of it being a checklist that they like compared to his behavior, it looked like it had been reverse engineered.
Yeah.
And I had felt that same way when I read that checklist of common symptoms for fibro. And because I'm the one who came to the conclusion that this was the fit, I don't think I went through as much denial as I would have if the doctor had said, I think you have this. Because I would have been like, oh, no, it can't possibly be that. But I had come to the conclusion myself. And so then it was just a matter of like, okay, well, what are we going to do about this?
I wonder if the person who sent you for that book knew that.
I think she knew that I would be more accepting of the diagnosis.
It's more objective, like.
Yeah,
no.
yeah. I'm pretty sure she knew that. She was, yeah.
It's impressive.
Yeah, it was, yeah, and you know, and with various doctors and specialists that I then encountered over the next several years, I didn't see any of that sort of wisdom in helping me cope and adapt to a new reality. I had people who flat out denied it and said it wasn't really a thing, that it was just a women's problem and it was exaggerated. And you know, I had doctors who said, well, you know, ibuprofen's where it's at, I guess. And I'm like, that's not even functional.
It's like you're being hysterical.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And
well, here's the part where I put more of a burden on you. Because
lay it on me.
Part of the idea is this understanding of some of these things you've personal experience with. Like, I love you articulating why you show up in activist spaces and what that's about. And I feel like in that is definitely you encouraging folks, like, find your way in. Mm-hmm. But what do you, like, I'm by and large able-bodied. I have my things, but, like, the world's kind of made for me, like, in most of my buckets. So what does someone like me do in service of the ableist challenges because it's so invisible? Like, how do I learn more about the realities?
Sure.
What are the tools for calling it out? Like, what, other than like you having to do all the heavy lifting, like if other people could come and lift a little bit, what do you think that would look like?
That's a super good question.
That's where it's a burden for you, though.
That's okay. No, that's okay.
It's like having an intern. What should I do, though?
No, yeah. I don't know. Figure it out. I think the first thing people should do is just ask about accommodations. It's very tiring for it to be the people who need them who are constantly asking for them. It doesn't normalize it, and it seems, I feel like I'm being very selfish and self-serving by asking somebody else to make accommodations for me, because I know that they're inconvenient sometimes, and that you might have the perfect march route planned out. You know, I think one of the best examples lately was the Women's March. There were virtually no accommodations for the disabled, and with the crowds, I mean, obviously not completely predicted or anything like that, but if I had been on crutches that day, or if I were in a chair or a scooter or something like that, I would have had to leave, because the crowds were impenetrable, and there weren't any aisles, or, you know, there was a small roped off area in front of the stage that was for chairs, I am told, because I couldn't even see it. I couldn't even get down there through the crowd to try to find some place where maybe there was a chair. And a lot of times those spaces, just like parking spots, are like, well, I'm just going to be here for a minute.
Just pop in.
Yeah. Or like, oh, but you know, my kid is really tired, so we're just going to sit down here for a little bit.
So there's real power, you're saying, in if you show up to an event, you're planning an event, you go to some organized thing, just ask, what are the accommodations for accessibility?
Yep.
To just raise awareness that should be in people's minds.
And to participate as fully as possible. A lot of people said and pointed me to, I think I had probably about like a dozen different people post this on my Facebook wall, be like, check this out, the virtual march. I'm like, are you kidding me? I get no sense of community. And that's not to say that there isn't an online sense of community, But if I want to be at an event like that, like a history-making event, sitting at home and logging into a website so I can be counted as virtually there.
And you know how to access virtual things already.
Yeah.
You don't need that help.
Yeah, exactly. I got my husband off the internet, so, you know, back when they were cheap.
That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
Back when they were cheap. You mean husband?
Yeah. I imported him. But having more than just disabled people asking what kind of plans there are is one way that you can advocate for it to be less sort of a niche concern. Like, well, we'll deal with that if we have to. Because the other thing that happens when those accommodations are made is that people benefit from seeing them. They become aware that there are these people, that there are disabled people involved in this too, and that normalizes including them.
It's a representation
Absolutely.
issue too.
Interestingly enough, one of the best places that handles this and is really sort of model is the local geek convention Convergence. I'm on their accessibility committee, and they really push the edges, and as a result, it's a very welcoming space for people with all kinds of disabilities or needs. There is taped off disability seating at every single panel, at every single event. It is inviolate. I mean, you know, they would really crack down hard if somebody were just casually occupying that space. And people are, even if something is full, if there's room in the accessibility section, they get in. They skip to the front of lines, they skip to the front of the elevator line, signs all around saying not all illnesses are visible. You know, if somebody says they have a problem, then they do, and believe them.
It seems like a group built on outsider status maybe has more awareness of looking for other kinds of outsiders like that.
Yeah, and
it's not always the case.
It's not always the case, but I think that's definitely part of it. A couple of years ago, so Gen Con is the biggest of the gaming conventions in the States, and a couple of years ago, maybe 5 years, I started pressuring them to make a sensory break room available. It's an overwhelming environment, and you don't even realize the roar in the dealer's hall or someplace else. You do not even realize the sheer volume until you walk out of it. And all of a sudden it's not there, and that silence or that absence of noise is like a thunderclap. It's just astonishing how much of your energy it's been taking up to focus through that and everything. And
smell too.
Oh God, all of those. It's better now. Back in the 90s, there were these rather snide people, but funny people who made a collect them all game at Gen Con, which was called Hygiene, and they had biohazard bags.
But accurate.
Yeah, exactly. They had biohazard bags that they would hand out with, you know, a little hotel soap or. And they would stand at the bottom of the escalators and hand them out to people and says, "Collect the set."
Oh, boy.
But it took me 2 years to get them to commit some space actually in the convention center, because of course it's a premium for other kinds of games and other kinds of panels and other activities. And I kept telling them, it's got to be here, because a 20-minute break here, someplace where I can just shut down for a little bit, 20 minutes of that lets me come back to be active again here for, you know, like usually about 4 hours.
Yeah.
If I walk back to my hotel room,
You're not coming
I'm
back.
out for at least 2 to 3 hours. Like, I'm not coming back.
I'm like that, and I don't have,
soon.
I mean...
No, that's the thing, is when I finally got them to do this and set it up, you know, I think they really expected that it would just be just a few people who just use it all the time. And we ended up having 718 unique uses of the room, and some of the people who were most appreciative of it were just people who are introverts or new to the convention, who just didn't know how to process all of the sensory information. And that little bit of downtime bought them a whole bunch more activity time, and it's been amazing to see how much people appreciate that now and think it's indispensable. And that's the other thing about accommodations, is that once you put it there and people decide for themselves that it's useful, they see it as indispensable, and it gets built into the way things are done. So if you can get over that initial obstacle and make the push and do whatever you have to do, twist arms and things like that, once that accommodation is there, other people than disabled people benefit by it. And then they start to wonder why that's not a thing in other spaces. And so they go on to advocate for it too. And it adds dimensions to anybody's experience of it, even on top of the sheer relief it is not to have to fight for accommodation as a disabled person. I finally gave up a couple of years ago and got a prescription for forearm crutches, because there are just days where I'm either just in a lot of pain, or what's more often is that I'm like body parts go unreliable on me. Like all of a sudden my right leg is just not dependable. It could go out at any minute. And the first time I walked into a place, I was meeting a friend for a drink, and at first the hostess said, well, we don't have any regular tables right now. Can you sit at a high top? And high tops are bad. High tops do all sorts of wonky things to your hips and back, and so they're not fun. And then she looked at me and said, oh, that won't work. Let me get you a table. And I didn't have to advocate for it. It was suddenly visible, and it was astonishing. It freed up a whole set of reserves. I go in armored to fight for this stuff. And a lot of times I don't bother to fight for it, because I just, if I'm going to spend my energy on one thing or another, I'm not going to spend all my time trying to explain to them why I have this invisible disability and that, I really, really need a chair right now.
I'm too tired to convince you I'm too tired.
Exactly. That is, paradoxical, but there it is. So having that stuff already set aside saves you the fight. And if you can save one fight, that's a spoon. That's, a piece of resources you can spend doing something else, like having fun and, not being as irritable with the kids because you're already running out of energy, or not having to leave an hour earlier when everybody is still having fun.
So I think your message is, us sort of typical folks need to go advocate for accessible spaces so that your kids will be less at risk of your rage.
It's true.
We're helping them.
Yeah. And then and just seeing that stuff. I mean, here's the thing. Disability is the one minority to which almost every single person will at some time belong.
We're all headed that way.
Exactly. Either it's just aging and general breakdown, or you bust your leg on the ski slopes, or you throw your back out. God, the first time my husband threw his back out, he was deeply upset and felt betrayed, and every time he moved, he was like, oh, and he's like, oh God, I can't do anything. And I just gave him these looks, and he's like, oh. He's like, but I can't move this way. I'm like, uh-huh. Yeah. I'm not trying to be unsympathetic.
No.
But seriously, welcome to my world.
Yeah.
This is, you make a lot of decisions about, am I gonna bend over and pick this thing up, or am I gonna go down, crouch down on my knees? And so all those little tiny thoughts, that's just more traffic in your brain that complicates things. So all of us are going to need these things at some time, and if you get used to seeing them available, then in a way that you'll be taken care of if and when you need that. I don't actually think like a lot of engineering students have to go through the day in a wheelchair on campus or something like that, and while walking in those shoes can be a way to highlight the need for these things. The fact of the matter is that they can get up and walk away anytime.
Well, flower babies don't prevent teen pregnancy.
No.
Like that's
No, they don't.
It's not what it does.
No.
It lets you talk about your childhood.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I also had one. But that's
Exactly.
That's not where empathy comes from.
Right. And, and in addition to seeing that, like, oh, these things will be here when I need them, you never know when an accommodation is going to make your life better.
Yeah.
So one of the things that they have at Convergence starts at like 11 p.m., and thank God for it. They have this terrible sci-fi erotica table read. And it is packed. I mean, they put over 1,000 people in that room. And I was super dragged out. But I had heard this was epic, and I really wanted to go. So there was a seat for me because there was a disabled section and it wasn't full. And there was one of our fantastic sign language interpreters had said, I'm not going to ask my agency to pay for this. I'm not going to, I'm just doing this because I want to do this. And the effect of having her in that room trying to communicate through sign language some of the things that were being said and were in these stories was a dimension of hilarity which I cannot accurately convey.
And everyone benefits from that.
And everybody benefits from this. I mean, she's acting out a Chuck Tingle story.
Well, people should Google Chuck Tingle.
Yes, please. Oh God, please. You will only do yourself a favor here.
Or just follow Bird Chick on Twitter, and you'll read a lot about Chuck Tingle.
Yes.
It's her passion.
It's so true. And it conveyed so many things all at once about accessibility. It reminded people that accessibility now is better than accessibility later. Yeah, you can closed caption that thing and put it up on YouTube in a day or two. But you don't get the experience of being present in that moment and fully experiencing it. So that's one of the rules I always say is accessibility now is better than accessibility later. Second, it reminded people that disabled people are whole people, and that means we have sex lives too. So that's something, because a lot of the way society deals with disabled people is infantilizing them or just assuming that they have no physical life because their physical life is limited, and that's just not true at all. And then the third thing was the dimension that it added for every single person in that room who could see her. I mean, she's on the floor making gestures. I honestly wish I could bleach from my brain, but oh my God, it was amazing. That took some thoughtfulness. It took some effort on her part, but it made accessibility fun. It made it enriching, and that actually probably took a lot of people's minds off the fact that there were actually deaf people using this to participate in the event. And so as strange as that whole thing is, that's the example I come back to time and again to make sure that people understand how accommodations can make something better for everyone. And the fact of the matter is that disability identity is as much shaping of our lives as being queer, being a person of color, being an immigrant. It's just one of those intersections. So while I have a great deal of concern for some of those intersections, like the way that special ed kids of color are so many more times likely to end up in the school to prison pipeline, or that mental health issues in the LGBTQ community represent a major problem, that suicide rates are higher and depression rates are higher, and sometimes they don't fit the patterns we think. The levels of depression and suicidality are higher in the bisexual community than they are in the gay and lesbian community. And, that's not known generally, but that all of those things go together and give a sense of perspective on other ways in which people are oppressed, and hopefully a form of empathy that, well, it's not exactly the same, obviously, but that these complexities are part of the people that we need to stand up for.
I just like how you've highlighted how sexy accessibility can be. I think that's the real marketing angle.
Yeah.
Well, Jess, where can people connect with you online? Like, what's the best way to get your...
I'm super active to a fault on Twitter.
True.
But that's also one of the places where I am plugged into.
Yeah, you're doing stuff on it.
Yeah, and the disability community online is a form of accessibility because nonverbal people, like other autistic people who are nonverbal, or people with CP or something like that who are nonverbal, can participate online.
And if you have mobility issues, you can be online.
And there's a lot of political activism happening in the disabled community on Twitter. There's a hashtag #CripTheVote, which started during the election season but is continuing now as issues of healthcare and self-sufficiency and things are on the line.
Yeah.
Talking just like one example of something that's been going on. The taking away Medicaid dollars means that more disabled people would be put in institutions because the resources wouldn't be there for them to live out on their own. And, that's a real deep concern. And it is what motivated, I think the number ended up being 54 disabled activists being arrested in Washington, D.C., protesting the proposed changes. And having been arrested before, really wasn't the plan, but I'll stand by it. Having been arrested, my own experience going through that system as sort of gently as I could as a white cis woman really drives home, the commitment that you have to have in order to risk that. And especially it's so much more when you are physically disabled and you can't count on the care that you generally need to be well.
Yeah, the risks are amplified.
The risks, exactly.
So you're at...
I'm at Prof. Banks.
Right.
And if you're out in the community and you see me, there's a good chance that my hair will be some Muppety color. That's just one of the things about me that I've decided I don't care enough to be normal about.
I like it. It makes it easy to find you.
It does. My hair was pink for 3.5 years because of the marriage amendment fight, because, it was, well, find the trainer with the pink hair. Mm-hmm. Well, find the legislative person with the pink hair. And the summer we won it. We won it in May, and I dyed my hair turquoise that summer. And I was the brightest incognito person out there because nobody was looking for that color. And so, that's just one of the things about me.
That's awesome. Well, Jess, I really appreciate you talking to me about all of this stuff.
Thanks so much. It's really lovely.
Season 2 of Not About You would not be possible without the generous support of Walker West Music Academy in St. Paul. Walker West provides music education to any student who wants to learn, offering a variety of lessons for all ages and all skill levels. Go to walkerwest.org for more information. I wouldn't be able to make Not About You without the deep learning and guidance of folks I've met through my time in the Sustainable Progress Through Engaging Active Citizens program, or SPEAK, based out of Hope Community in Minneapolis. Go to hope-community.org to check out all the amazing work being done at Hope Community. Support them if you've got the resources to do so. Season 2 of Not About You would truly not be possible without all the amazing folks who agreed to be guests and share their valuable time and considerable experiences with me. So go seek out their work and find ways to support them. And of course, this show only really has meaning if you listen and share. So thanks for listening. Now go share. Tell someone about the show. Share it on social media with the hashtag NAPOD. Post an iTunes review. Please post an iTunes review. Help me get these conversations out to more folks. The Not About You theme song is Rebels of Our Own Kind by Charlie Van Stee, used with permission from Charlie. This is Not About You.